Hello and welcome to Woody Minis. I'm Woody, and today we are going to be tackling one of my all-time favourite models, the metal Marneus Calgar, released about 20 years ago.
Right, let's take a closer look. So we've got the traditional missing pieces of the right shoulder tassel. I've got it provided for me in a little baggie, and this is where it would normally go. Okay, he's got all his pieces, nothing's missing, that's a good sign. And the percussion therapy, yep, he seems pretty solid. I took a closer look at the paint job and just appreciated how this person's labour of love was formed. There's a lot of recess shading on some of these little purity seals. There's lots of edge highlights. The freehand on the cloak as well is pretty thick. It's clearly been attempted a few times, and there's a lot of deep cracks in this paint. I think it is maybe a millimetre thick in some places. Looking at his arm joints, there's a lot of exposed metal, and superglue was absolutely overflowing out of it. So, yes, he's going in the paint stripper. I did feel a little bit bad about taking away someone's hard work, but, it's all for a good cause. I sealed the jar of paint stripper under the miniature and took it outside where the smelly fumes wouldn't bother my lungs. The next day I brought him back inside, rinsed him off completely, and put him into a tub of clean water. I gave it a little quick scrub and was able to get away some of the paints, and took a look at what I was working with. The first step was disassembling this model. It didn't take much effort to rip off his arm. The head, it required a bit of leverage with the metal tweezers. After searching around on the floor and under the bed, I was able to find it again and start working on stripping it off. For this, I just used a little craft knife to get into all those little recesses and take out all the little bits of paint that were still there to make sure I could get details when it came to the paint job later. Didn't take too long. It was quite, good practice for fine motor skills. I did try to be gentle with the body, however the paint was just too thick and the brush wouldn't take it all off, so I had to resort to the craft knife and tweezers to get rid of all this paint. It took a fair while, but using the flat edge of the blade, I was able to reveal some of the hidden details of this model. I mean, just look at that. Turns out it was a skull. I also carefully used the knife to remove all of the excess superglue around the joints, and used the tweezers to peel off all of the rest of the paint that wouldn't seem to budge from his arms and gauntlets. Any paint left in the recesses obscuring any details was removed with a little craft knife and some gentle poking, prodding, and scraping, until both of the arms were finished, shiny and chrome. I repeated this process for all the other parts of the model until everything was shiny. The tassel was looking good, as was the eagle, but when I'd finished the eagle I did notice some mould lines which I gently scraped off and sliced off with the craft knife, and with this done we were left with all of the pieces. I took a closer look at the pieces and did notice some problems for assembly. There's a little burr on the top of his legs that would really make it difficult to fit into the torso. I cut it away with a craft knife, bracing myself against my cutting mat while doing so. I checked the fit with just a dry fit, and it was pretty good. To stop my metal mini having the constant problem of falling apart due to poor superglue, I decided to try pinning for once. I drilled in some 1mm holes into the torso and into the top of the legs. I clipped off a piece of brass wire, the same diameter as the hole, superglued it inside, trimmed it down to size, matched it up with the other side of the model, and it was a pretty good fit. This would ensure my model wouldn't fall apart at the slightest breeze. I've repeated the pinning process for both of his arms, because let's face it, they fall off way too easily. The next problem I had to solve was the fact that his foot peg was far too large for the hole in the base. It was really wobbly and, well, you know what would happen. I mixed together some epoxy putty and just inserted it into the hole in the base. Next, I put some water over the metal peg, pushed it in to leave a correct diameter hole for him to go in. We were now on to sticking on the smallest pieces, like the Aquila on top of his Terminator armor plates. And as anyone that's had Marneus Calgary knows, this is the bit that falls off. Again, we're going to pin it together. I carefully drilled the hole, repeated the whole pinning process with some super glue, some brass wire, and it's a pretty solid fit. I'm really happy with it, and it fits in really well. There was a small little gap, but I'd solve that with some epoxy putty later. The rest of the details I just super glued on into their respective spots, because they were just too thin to be pinned into place properly. I also just glued the head in because there was a pretty good fit there, and it wasn't in any exposed areas in danger of being knocked off. With all the pieces stuck together, I re-glued him to his base and took him outside to spray paint him with a black primer. I stuck him onto my makeshift painting handle and began the painting process. I began with base layer of Macragge blue, 2 thin coats all over his Terminator armor. There are lots of small details here that I just had to avoid with the paintbrush because I really want to keep that black base coat for when I do the metallics. Of course, he wouldn't be an Ultramarine without a lot of gold. I initially looked at Auric gold, but it was way too light. I then looked at Balthazar gold. It was too dark, so I decided to mix them together to find the colour that I wanted. I mixed it together in my paint palette and began painting the details, the eagle on his shoulder, the details on his tassels, and then I began framing his face and his helmet with some gold around this hood. It took a few thin coats to get it how I wanted, but that's just the way of working with metallics, isn't it really? There were a lot of details on this model. These crosses on his tassels were pretty tough, and then again there's a lot more details on his arms, gauntlets and shoulders that I needed to paint too. He's starting to look like a real Ultramarine now. Next I mixed together some Mephiston red with some brown dryad bark to paint the cloak. This was the base layer for the inside of the cloak, as well as the back of the cloak too. I then added a layer of pure Mephiston red to the back of the cloak, as it would get more light. Whilst I still had red on my paint palette, I painted on the details of his gauntlet too, as well as the ropes on his front, and the tassels. Next up was purity seals, and boy oh boy, this guy has a lot of purity. At least 7 by my count, and to be honest, I might have even missed some. The next base layer to get painted was white, and I'm using white scar here to paint all of the Ultramarine decals as well as the skulls. The Aquila was the first one to do, and to be honest, I missed a few of the little recesses here, and I got some paint in them by accident, but that's going to be fixed with Null Oil later. And if you thought this guy had a lot of purity seals, well, he's got even more skulls. He's got 4 on each gauntlet, 1 on his front armor plate, 1 on his back armor plate, and to be honest, he's got some on his legs and the base and his sigils as well. To paint his chain fist belt feeds, I used a simple little dry brush of some lead belcher. I also applied the same colour to the metallic details on his face and the armour rivets. There were also some smaller details on the armour, the laurels, which I'd wanted to paint green. I started out with a base layer of moot green, and it's really helping it pop. It draws a lot of attention to different parts of the body. I then moved on to Wraithbone to paint all the parchments for all his purity seals. I then used about 4 layers of Flashgit's yellow to paint some of the wiring for the control of his weapons. I edge highlighted all of his armor with a mix of white scar and Macragge blue, and this really helped it pop. He's starting to look like a really well paid attention to model now. I then added a lighter highlight by just adding a little bit more white into my paint mix. I made sure to apply this highlight to all the parts of the armor that were facing upwards where the light source would traditionally be, especially around the hood so I could draw attention to his face once it had been completed. I also added edge highlights to all of his tassels, all of these leather pieces, and I also tried to add a slightly bit of brighter auric gold to the gold bit. He was still looking a bit flat, so let's see if the Null Oil will help him pop. I applied the Null Oil absolutely everywhere where there were recesses that weren't quite looking well. All of these bits of gold, all the skulls, all the recesses for the detailed armor pieces, especially the gold and the eagles, as well as all of the skulls. It really made a big difference on the Aquila at the top. By fitting into these little recesses, you could actually see the Ultramarine symbol, rather than just the letter U. I switched over to Agrak's Earthshade for his cloak, to add some shadows to these little creases. I was pretty happy with most of his armour. He's looking like a real champion now, and it's now time for some bits that I've forgotten. Yes, the text on the purity seals, a very important step. I used my smallest paintbrush and very, very small thin lines of Chaos Black to simulate some text. I also free-handed Calgar onto his left leg off camera. I'm always nervous about painting faces, especially because the last time I painted a face was about a year ago. I base coated this one with a mix of Bugman's Brown and Wraithbone to give it a warm undertone. 2 thin coats, and this is what it looked like. Of course, he wouldn't be a son of Gulliman without a wash of Gulliman's flesh. This sank down into the recesses and really helped his face get a bit more character. I applied it liberally before moving on to some black eyes, and I was pretty nervous about this, so it happened off camera. I added more Wraithbone to my mix to highlight his forehead, nose, and his eyebrows, cheekbones, any prominent features on his face that would catch more light. And it was looking pretty good, and it gave me a bit of a confidence boost to work more on the eyes on camera this time. I painted his smile with some pure white over the teeth, just to, build up a bit of confidence before trying to get his eyeball done. And it worked pretty well, until I spilt a bit into his lip. Luckily it was in the recess, so I can fix it later. Right, confidence time. Yep, small paintbrush, white paint. Do it off camera, do it on camera. Yeah, off camera. But it did work pretty well, so I was very happy with it. This time I had enough courage that I worked well. It was time to add the pupil. And I gently, slowly tickled it forward until I had reached the center of his eyeball. I wanted to make him look angry, so the smallest dot in the middle would be perfect. And let's see if we do it. Keep trying closer until eventually a little bit of paint's left the brush. And my gosh, the angry man is here. Perfect. Get in. I was super chuffed with this, and next time it's all on camera, I promise. Now, I wanted to keep everything up to standard, so I did use a bit of Nuln Oil to fix that gap in his mouth where the white was. I then worked on the hair by base coating with Wraithbone. I added the first highlight with a mix of Wraithbone and White Scar, and I added the final highlight solely with White Scar, just on a few strands of hair on the top of his head. With almost everything done, I decided to work on the rock he was standing on. I wiped away the excess paint onto a tissue paper and started just dry brushing some grey onto the stones. Once I'd finished all of the stones, I added a bit of white to make it lighter and just did the edges, making sure not to get any on the model. And final details time, I promise. It's all the gems and lenses. I base coated all of them with a red. And after doing all the details in red, I needed a brighter colour to add a little illusion of light going through. I chose Layer of Fire Dragon Bright Orange and added it to the centre of his Auspex lens. I added a crescent shape underneath the red gems. Following on from this, I needed to add a smaller dot of Flash Git's yellow, crescent shape for underneath the circular gems, and a little dot for the Auspex, of course. I finished off the gems with a very, very small dot of pure white, just on the top where it would naturally be reflecting the light, giving the illusion of an above light source. And as it turns out, over the past 20 years or so, base sizes have changed, so I'd need to swap him from his standard 40mm to, I think, a 60mm base. I just superglued down his rock onto, a spare painting palette base, and added some texture to it using AK Terrain's Light Earth acrylic texture paint, using, of course, the filthiest brush that I had. Yuck. After getting a bit onto the base, I wanted to keep it quite clear from the rock, so I used a simple sculpting tool to spread it around until it was all even. Great, looking good, but I don't want him on a desert, I want him in just a normal bog standard muddy field with some grass, so of course it's Agrak's Earthshade all over. I then superglued down a whole bunch of grass tufts, and it wouldn't be a 40k miniature without a smattering of skulls as well.
Now, before I spoil you all with a grand reveal, I would like to shout out eBay for making this possible, simply because they exist, and that's pretty nice. I was able to find this Marneus Calgar model on eBay for a steal alongside his Honor Guard. It only cost me about £50 or $60 or so. I don't know how money works these days, I spent it all on Warhammer. And if you spend all your money on Warhammer, and would actually not like to spend all your money on Warhammer, but still have the same amount of Warhammer, check out eBay. Using the affiliate link below in my description, you can find just about everything, and all you'll need to invest in is a paint stripper, a toothbrush, and a jar. Anyways, here you go. I hope you guys have enjoyed watching this video as much as I've enjoyed making and painting this miniature. It's really taken me back to my childhood and real love of painting without the distractions of YouTube, posting for Instagram and all those things. Well, I did post on YouTube, so you might as well like and subscribe. Thank you.